Well, you probably didn't realize that there were so many opinions that I have about elders. You may have not even realized that that many opinions were even possible. And yeah, I have to apologize to a degree for the fact that I feel very strongly about the value of the role of elders. And part of why I feel this strongly is because the when elders are doing their job well, they help ensure and nurture the health of God's family, the congregation that they serve. So, I don't know how many bunny trails I've taken, but I've taken a lot, and I'm okay with that. One more, at least one more today on elders and what is their job. I kind of have been very fuzzy, and as I try to get more specific about the job that an elder does, it gets more and more difficult. I think here's why. In order for me to be able to kind of put my finger on what should the actual tasking, what should the actual work of an elder be, I would need to know the church they're serving. See, when you have the character of an elder, as described by Paul to Timothy and Titus, nobody measures up to that perfectly, but in a relative sort of way, mature elders use that as kind of the tool of discerning and evaluating their own fitness for this role of elder. One of the things that Peter writes about being an elder is here in the last part where he back in verse 2, he says, "Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be." This is 1 Peter chapter 5. And then he goes on, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve. Notice that he doesn't say eager to rule. He says eager to serve. This is very important. And one of the things that I think hinders, in a lot of cases, hinders elders serving well is that we live in a culture that frames most things up in a democratic sort of way, where you have majority ruling, you have this hierarchy of ruling bodies. And in a lot of churches, I've mentioned this before, in a lot of churches, the elders are placed in a position that would be somewhat like the Senate for the U.S. or for the state you live in, where they make rules, they make laws, and hopefully, in the best case, for the good of all. Well, you know what? That's not what Peter indicates here. It's not about making rules. It's about serving. And it's because you're willing as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain. One of the dishonest gains, an obvious one, is somehow that you would benefit financially from this position. I'm not sure how, in our culture, I'm not sure how that would work. I do know this, though, in a non-monetary way, one of the gains, and a dishonest gain, is how in that role as an elder, there is such a thin line between gratification and pride. An immature person will take the fact that they've been placed in a role like the role of elder, and they find not just gratification, but they become proud, as though they deserve the role they're in. See, that's how immature people handle this level of responsibility in this important role. I read for me, it was a groundbreaking book. About, 15, 16 years ago now, called The Emotionally Healthy Church. It's by a guy from Queens, New York, a pastor, who he followed that book up with Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, which is way too many syllables for a book title. But the content of the book, both of those books, is stellar. I highly, highly recommend those books. He's written one other, The Emotionally Healthy Leader. Pete Scazzaro, great thinker, and devoted to following Christ in the steps of Christ. It's there's so much more to the book, but this one thing so applies when we talk about the role of elders. He makes a very, very good case for the fact that it is in fact impossible to be spiritually mature and emotionally immature. My experience is that very often, and I won't say always, it isn't always, but very often, people are put into positions of responsibility because they're perceived as being spiritually mature since they have been at this church for 35 years. They haven't missed Sunday school in 30 years. They know the books of the Bible. They have half dozen verses memorized. And we take this data bank of Christian information to equal their spiritual maturity. I don't think that's true. I have known people who knew tons about the Bible, but their emotional maturity it wasn't very good at all. They treated people poorly. They treated their families poorly. They fudged on issues that should never be fudged on. They were borderline dishonest at times, but because they knew the Bible, we considered them spiritually mature. Peter, I believe, is pointing to men who are emotionally mature and spiritually mature, not one or the other. It is possible to be emotionally mature and spiritually immature. There are people who don't know Christ, who don't walk with God, who have developed a fairly high measure of emotional maturity. But for them to have spiritual maturity, they've got to have this personal, dynamic, healthy, growing relationship with God through Christ because of grace and faith. Well, can go a long time with that, and I'm good at going a long time with stuff, but I'm going to leave it at that. When an elder has both real spiritual maturity and emotional maturity, they serve for the highest motivation, for the right reasons, not in order to gain prestige. Only a mature elder can walk this tightrope that is often strung between pride and gratification. As an elder, you get to speak into the life of the church and the life of individuals on a level that is very, very deep. The atmosphere is thin because of how high that is and how the depth in people's lives. And having that privilege, it should give us a sense of gratification, but only a mature person can maintain this dynamic balance between the gratification and the pure pride. Well, eager to serve. And then, as if that didn't get your attention, verse 3, not lording over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. Examples to the flock. You know that old saying, actions speak louder than words. It's pretty true. I've heard both sides of either it was St. Francis of Assisi or that it wasn't St. Francis of Assisi, but this quote has often been attributed to him. Preach the gospel always. When necessary, use words. I don't know who thought that up, but I think it applies to elders. An elder is not charged with ruling over, with lording it over those entrusted to them. Now, there's a whole bunch in that, but I'm not going to take all 5 minutes left here to say it. Not lording it over those entrusted to you. Don't ever forget, these people are under your care as a trust, as you must be then a steward of that trust. And you can't execute as a steward well when you're trying to lord it over others. When Christ made it clear to his disciples, and it should be clear to us, but it's so not clear so often, that the first would be last. And the greatest would have to be the servant of all. That's the principle. Not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. If you're an elder, if you've been designated into that role in a congregation, my first question to you is how you feel about your example. Are you authentic enough to be transparent in the way you live, the things you do, the choices you make? I'm not saying are you perfect. I'm just saying are you authentic enough that when people look into your life, they see that authenticity and they are attracted to it and they desire it in their own lifestyle? Or are you like the Pharisees, who Jesus said they load people up with all kinds of rules? And then he goes on to say, do what they tell you, but don't do what they do. I think if an elder slides over into that Pharisee lifestyle, they become a cancer. This is a strong statement. I believe it to be true, though. They become a cancer to the congregation. Examples to the flock. You probably need to unpack that on your own a good bit. And then he goes on and he kind of puts the cap on this. And when the chief shepherd appears, who's the chief shepherd? Well, that's Christ. He identified himself as the good shepherd. He is the chief shepherd. When he appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. There's a sense in which you're highly honored that you would be given this, this crown of glory, this designation, this bestowed glory. But you know, on the other hand, you're no more honored than the least of the believers that you know. Aren't we all going to receive that crown when Christ returns and he finds us faithful? Our names are in the Lamb's book of life. And because of God's grace, not my work, not my effectiveness, not my passion, but God's grace, by his grace, I'll receive a crown of glory that will never fade away. That's highest of all motivations. But so much else in the world pulls and tugs at our attention, it's hard to keep it in mind. Well, believe it or not, we're ready to move on away from this topic of elders next time when we get together on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.